Wonderful good afternoon and good morning, or even good night for some of you from Hamburg. It's a rare sunny day in Hamburg, but we're talking about a not so sunny subject today. We're basically talking about financial distress, and I'm sure we've all experienced that in our lifetime personally at some point or another, where there simply isn't enough money to go around and to make it to the end of the month. And just like individuals, NGOs also frequently and sometimes experience financial distress. Financial distress, we get to that definition in a moment, but basically it's a lack of time, a lack of money, and sometimes I'm afraid a lack of trust amongst everybody as well. As much as these things are standard and as financial distress is to be expected for every organization at some point or another, there are some proven and really useful techniques to deploy if you find yourselves, or should your organization ever find itself in that situation. All I'm hoping today is to share some of these with you so that you can be better armed and better spot the warning signs, better armed to respond when this happens, and hopefully not fall into a panic or frustration or resignation even, and work your way up. I'm doing this with my colleagues around the world because we really believe that in order to reach the SDGs, we need strong and extremely successful NGOs. And that means a lot of things. It doesn't actually mean just money. In fact, that's secondary. But it certainly means well-funded and well-run organizations. And this is what MZN does since now nearly 15 years. And that part of turning around an NGO that has fallen on hard times, that experienced a cash flow crisis, is certainly part of something we do quite regularly. The good news is there's always a way out, or almost always a way out. The bad news is that where external help or some fundamental hard thinking isn't done, the turnaround is rarely successful. So let's kick it off. We've got about 40 minutes left. I'm hoping to get through this in about 20-25 minutes, so to leave plenty of questions and answers time for you. As my fantastic colleague Jules said, please put them into the Q&A and then we'll get around to them. Kick it off. You know me by now, I'm going to skip that part and get straight to the challenge we have. I want to briefly talk about the challenge we have these days, and the challenge ahead, but it's only going to get harder. I want us to think about this a little bit differently. And thirdly, I'd like to share some steps that are obviously at a high level. They need to be tailored, and there are more steps for every organization, depending on your personal and your organization's circumstances. But I think based on a decade and more of experience in turning around financially struggling nonprofit organizations, I can say that these 3 steps apply to most, if not all, situations. We are going to mention some actual cases here today. But of course, we will never ever share any live client data. So where we mention a client's name in this conversation, we have explicit written permission to do so in order to share the lessons learned. And in all other cases, we have anonymized the mentioning of it in line and in compliance with our terms and conditions and data protection. All right. So first of all, a bit of a general input. Our very good friends at Interaction, a large NGO group in the US, has done an interesting survey this year and last year as well. And it basically asked leaders in NGOs about their operational, external operating environment, which is basically a very fancy word for saying the market. And as you can see here, almost more than 2/3 of the organization's leaders say that, that is significantly changing, either strongly or somewhat agree. There's a lot of change ahead. There's a lot of things that require updating. And as a result, we find more and more NGOs whose business model, the way they work, the way they finance themselves, it has to adapt or even transform. We also find that there is a massive over-reliance in many of our NGO partners on institutional donors, and that is simply not viable. They don't pay enough overheads, and it's a bit of a rat race. Get a grant, implement the grant, get the next grant. It doesn't allow for essential investments into training, systems building, and innovation. And if we want to stand a chance at reaching the SDGs, if we want to build a better world, we have to work innovatively. Simply tackling problems in the same old way we have done for the last 10 or even 50 years is not going to make much of a difference anymore. We also find that most organizations really need to flex faster. So they need to build in changing themselves as part of their business operating model. That is stressful at the best of times, but it can, again, this can be done smoother, and hopefully share some ways with you today. And in all that, we obviously find a lot of more competition. Whereas up to like 15, 20 years ago, NGOs were pretty unique in what they do. They face far more competition these days from social enterprises, other NGOs rising through the ranks, and in fact, corporates entering into the NGO space, not just as a CSR theme, but actually as a viable business. So we need to, first of all, think about how we think. And I'd like to start with the leaders in the organization. It's very stressful to be in a situation where there is not enough budget, where you may have to do redundancies, or where programs may even have to be cut. And the first and worst reaction that some of the leaders and some of the decision makers I've had the pleasure of working with over the last 15, 20 years is that they sort of put their head into the sand, the Strauss syndrome. And I would strongly open up the exact opposite, putting all the facts on the table. A leader doesn't need to have all the answers or all the way forward to put the facts on the table, because the fact is that in these situations there's simply not enough money. There's often not enough time to do anything substantial, and that causes the organization and within the leadership group a deterioration of trust in either the turnaround prospect and way, or even into each other. So you don't have enough money, you don't have enough time, and probably not enough trust. That's an uncomfortable and difficult situation to be in. But putting the facts on the table, saying this is how it is, this is our financial situation, this is how long our funding lasts, this is what the challenges we face, without immediately posing a solution to this, causes at least an acknowledgement of the situation that isn't being dragged. And that causes at least trust to some degree to stop evaporating. Now, secondly, most leaders who go through these times, they also call for a shared sacrifice with clear goals and timing, and to do so urgently. So once you have a restructuring, once you have a turnaround plan for your organization, that probably requires a lot more work from your staff members and your colleagues. Some colleagues will definitely have to leave your organization, or most likely at least some programs may have to be cut. That sacrifice needs to be acknowledged, called for clearly, and have a clear goal of when the tightening the belt phase ends. It might be 4 years away. It might be 5 years away. It might be a long path, but putting a number on it and putting a time scale on it will help the organization to stop bleeding trust and set a clear time frame for everybody. And finally, we do need to acknowledge what we have failed to do. So we do need, even in this distrustful, in this stressed situation, we probably need to adapt and innovate how things are done, or even what is being done, even transform. So although it sounds incredibly hard to change, adapting or transforming when you're barely hanging on, that needs to be considered. Otherwise, you're just dealing with this particular financial distress. And the next one is sure to come around the corner. We can't just can't just put a plaster on the situation and hope it goes well the next time. I think that would be the definition of insanity, actually. So moving on. The organizations, as I said, NGOs in particular, really have to change how they work. That doesn't mean that they change what they do. So beyond this immediate financial pressure, the organization needs to make change, but what really makes your organization special, what really, your local connections, your methodology for implementing your aid, all that shouldn't change. That's sort of the secret ingredient of your organization, and that needs to be preserved, strengthened, applied differently, maybe utilized differently in country, in the how, maybe differently run as well, but what you do cannot substantially change unless you're of the opinion that your services are no longer needed. So again, even in a financial distress situation, successful leaders, I observe, communicate this need to change their business model and support a change culture in one of two ways, as I just mentioned. Either adapt, so find a better and more efficient ways to do the same, so do what you do better and faster, or even transform, so do completely new things that advance your hopefully still relevant mission. That is part of a transformation, and that also is a good way to change things that you wanted that needed to change for a long time. Reminiscent of the old byword, never waste a good crisis. If it's a crisis anyway, you may as well change what doesn't work. So what are the major steps? Number one, plan. Plan out your way, list out on a simple piece of paper the shocks, the trends, and the changing environment. That acknowledgement is essential. Maybe speak to other NGOs, speak to advisors, speak to the donors, speak to the beneficiaries, most importantly, about what has changed. Then get your finance hat on and calculate what it would cost to do nothing. If you're in a financial distress situation and your income is dipping below your expenses, i.e. you're making a loss, you can easily project when you have to stop. Maybe it's not quite that critical, but maybe the opportunity cost of not doing something is incredibly high. So list out and get to a single figure of what does it cost to not change. If the costs are minimal, which I don't think there will be, then don't change. If the costs are a showstopper, or massively bad for the people you serve, then you have a strong mandate, and you build a strong mandate internally to effect some change. And thirdly, acknowledge what you don't know. Saying, we have suffered this, we don't know the changing donor environment, there's a lot we don't control. Let's get that in bullet points written down, because any restructuring plan built on assumptions that you don't control is very likely to go bad. We'll get back to that point later. Next, don't act immediately, but think. Do we have the leadership courage? Do we have the mandate internally? Do we have a strong management team enough to actually do the change? Secondly, is our business model really sustainable? Or is the business model fundamentally flawed? Are we just what I see a lot around change plans and organizations that are never getting enough funding, only scraping by, or even making a loss, is that they're sort of tinkering around the edges. That makes no sense. If you are trying to fix a fundamental illness with a few plasters, yeah, you might survive another day. But you're not really changing the organization. You're not really changing how you can generate impact. Secondly, again, get your finance hat out and have a clear look at what income you have, what reserves we have. Do we even have the money and the longevity to effect a major change? If not, then that evaporates certain restructuring and change options, which is good in a way because it makes a decision how to change easier. It's bad in a way because we have limited choice. Usually, by the way, the longer we leave it, the less options we have. So we might want to do this early. And finally, let's of course start acting. As I said, name a clear sacrifice, super clear communication, not just to your staff, also to your beneficiaries, to your implementation partners, to your donors. Very clear deadlines by when what will be reached, and very clear metrics, what are we trying to do. Clarity in communication will reinforce the trust into the restructuring and turnaround plan, but also into each other. And that is increasingly a vital ingredient to any successful crisis management, any successful turnaround. Good. Let's have a quick look at two interesting financial truths, simply. Number one, we need to define for that the sort of distress that we are doing. You're usually, not in all cases, but usually facing two types of distress. Either a structural one, and don't mind the massive definition. By the way, my colleague will email you, I think, the presentation or the recording later, so you don't need to sort of massively write all this. Either a structural distress, so where there are just too many organizational inefficiencies, too many siloed programs and practices, and there's a long-term deterioration of efficiency, effectiveness, possibly income, certainly a long-term increase or stubbornly increasing or stubbornly constant costs. And the problem may or may not lie with what you fundamentally do, but it certainly lies in the way your organization does it. It usually happens in some form or shape to all organizations, but when it is bleeding the organization dry by 1,000 little cuts, and that's what we call a structural distress. So the structure and how we do things needs to change. In a way, these are the more difficult ones because the mandate by management, the sort of the call to action, the ability to rally the forces internally and do something about it tends to be weaker when the distress and the financial loss is coming in small drips and drabs. The immediate distress comes in as a shock. A massive change in income, i.e. a donor falls away or a signature program has to close, or a sort of sudden change in ability to implement, or a sudden change in ability to operate. For example, 50 staff walk out, or your key donor walks away, or a whole country is basically becoming inaccessible, like Afghanistan, to implement programs and things like that. These immediate shock events are often outside the control of the organization, but it's sort of exaggerated, it makes made worse by poor organizational planning and safety nets. So they fall into some sort of hole here. The good news is here that if something suddenly happens, the belief and the mandate for management is usually stronger. And that's where most the leaders also react. So I would be more careful about the structural distress than the immediate one, because the immediate is obvious. Oh, sorry. Now, allow me, apologies. Allow me 2 minutes on the financial nature of turnaround. You've seen here in my fantastic graph without any numbers, the green line that is supposed to be income and a red line that is supposed to be expenses. All I want to really get at is that in the short term, income can fall or rise, but in this case fall quite suddenly, and then for NGOs tends to increase substantially and steadily only over time, only over the long term. However, expenses, be it your salary expense, your office rent, your IT costs, your software subscriptions, your hiring costs, etc., in the short term, at least 30, 60, 90 days, they are pretty fixed. So any strategy that is so urgent, I've seen this time and time again, that is built upon immediately reducing the cost to get the red line below the green line again, sort of cannibalizing the organization, is unlikely to work because its cash flow effect is unlikely to materialize until month number 4 or 5. You can't just kick out stuff. There are laws and regulations to uphold. There's knowledge transfers to be organized. That takes a few months. So it's worthwhile bearing in mind that when you plan a restructuring, when you're trying to get back into the green, that your expenses, at least for the short term, are pretty fixed. And that means that your income can probably change only over the long term as well. So that dictates a way that you can change your organization towards more financial viability to get to that situation again here, whereby the income exceeds the cost, of course. That is sustainable. So I think it's worthwhile bearing in mind. And also that very nature of expenses and income sort of takes the realistic stress out of a restructuring, because in the very short term, 30 to 60 to 90 days, there's nothing or very little you can do about this in most cases. So how do we do it? Well, like any good turnaround, like any good action, you plan, you control, you evaluate. So a financial distress, just a reminder, means you have also strained financial resources. You probably experience increased donor scrutiny as the donor realizes your financial situation isn't as sustainable as they would like. You have a sort of demoralized management, everything is hard, and concerned employees and sort of struggling beneficiaries. And they are felt, these challenges are felt across the entire organization, be it the programs team, the finance HR, the policy, the communications. So it's quite difficult to lead in this time. There are sort of 3 steps that can help us structure this. There will be to a varying degree applicable to your case, in case you're ever in the situation. Let's get into them. Oops. So we talked about the plan part already. And let's talk, sorry, I'm having problems with my, here we go. Let's talk about the evaluation plan. Any plan and any sort of restructuring needs to be based on a very clear understanding of what the real problems are. As I said earlier, otherwise you're just tinkering around the edges. There needs to be a very clear financial analysis. Where are the losses coming from? Is it a singular program? Is it a singular country? Is it one particular process or a few? Are we structurally too expensive? Is it a short-term effect? Is this a long-term effect? Has this problem bedeviled us for years, or has this just suddenly sprung up? What is the cash flow nature of this one? Can we change it in 30, 60, 90, or only 180 days? What are the income sources? Are they constant? Which ones are growing steadily? So I think the financial analysis is absolutely critical before taking any swift action. Then, of course, armed with that analysis, you want to examine all the activities and operations. Are there any operations or programs or processes that are underperforming? Some maybe just not relevant anymore, you know? And then, yes, you do want to possibly review some personnel. So over time, what happens quite a lot is that program staff become sort of core staff. You hire them for a program, you hire them for a project over 2-3 years, and because they are very good colleagues, and because we love them, and because we need them, and we would like to keep the knowledge, we kind of take them on as core staff without really having the funding for it. That happens quite a lot. So the departments sort of swell, but they don't really contract. We call this that grants are sticky. Once a department, a country, or a country office has acquired a grant, they hire to implement the grant. And then after the grant is implemented, they don't contract back down to the size that they were previously, but they sort of retain a number of their staff, and they carry these staff levels that have sort of unnecessary now, particularly when priorities change. So you may want to watch out for that typical mistake. So you definitely on the communication side, as I said, I want to say again, is openly put all the facts on the table. So do meet if you're a decision maker, meet with your staff, with your beneficiaries, talk to your donors, talk to your management, talk to your governance function, your board or something like whoever runs your organization, and communicate very openly, even if you don't have a plan just yet. I think that communication is absolutely essential for the trust to be rebuilt. Next thing is control. So if it's a very dire situation, you may have to create a weekly or even a daily cash flow. We've had situations where we've done this, and we're tracking all spending. We are proving every expense before it's being spent. We switch to lower cost vendors and try to make that work. And we obviously evaluate our staffing needs. We look at all programs and services offered, and we end the program delivery for programs that are just not performing. So that sort of seizing of control is very, very uncomfortable, creates a lot of work, almost can never be done without external assistance, and it sort of needs a very sort of distant and clear way of management and at arm's length. It is quite uncomfortable, but it has happened to work. And it's, controlling this cash flow, stopping the bleeding is usually one of the first steps that I can recommend here. Then we plan. One idea is to form an advisory board that guides and supports us through rebuilding of the organization. We'll make sure that we bring key employees together, have a candid conversation about how we rebuild, make sure that our reserves take this curve, saying, yes, we are down. Hopefully, we're not in the negative. We can first stabilize and then get back up. And we take opportunities to collaboratively create a plan that possibly fixes any structural issues that have bedeviled us for years, if not decades. And if you can, invest. A short-term cash flow crisis may still leave you able to invest into areas that needed to be rebuilt. So not using the reserves could actually make it worse in the turnaround. And you may want to, not just use reserves to temporarily shore up a failing organization, but actually rebuild a new one, rebuild a stronger organization, one that is, returns to its mission, has a clear appeal to donors and a clear impact route. If you do that, if you manage that, then usually after the financial distress, the organization comes out much stronger than it was before. Good, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much. I hope you got some questions and I hope this wasn't too high level. I think, Jules, you got some announcements, is that correct?
I do. I thought maybe we should do the questions and then the announcements, but I'm
happy. Yeah, cool, absolutely.
So if anyone would like to ask a question, please do ask in the Q&A box. Right now, we actually only have one question, so I'm hoping more will pop in. Martina has asked, by way of example, I think it was on slide 8, by way of example, what would be an example of an adapt or of a transform?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Martina, you said?
Yes.
So by definition, again, adapting is sort of changing how we do something, but not really changing what we do. And a transformation, I mean, we are actually fundamentally changing what we do. So to give you an example from a partner organization, I have to anonymize here, is there's an organization in Europe with offices in the US and all over Africa. And their mission remains very relevant. The development mission is absolutely essential. But the way that they organize themselves is around a heavy, cost-intensive global north office structure, and too far removed from the implementation fields, etc. So we transformed and we sort of changed and adapted these offices to be donor liaison offices, but moved program management, M&E, and all these things over into the global south. That helped the localization substantially. That helped reduce cost. It helped, massively reduce the time it took them to do things like an evaluation or program development, because they were simply closer to the field. It also increased their appeal to donors, as after that year of transformation, they were much closer to the areas they worked in. And the traditional offices in Berlin, London, Brussels, and New York turned out to do what they are originally supposed to do only, which is a donor liaison. And that has worked really well. So that's an example of a heavy adaptation, but they haven't really changed programmatically what they do. In terms of transformation, we have worked recently with a UK organization whose mission is so specialized that donors lost interest and they really struggled getting grants and getting income. So we have to actually transform them to use their special source, so to speak, their special skill set and their track record to be complementing currently funded action. And that has transformed what they do to some degree, to a very real degree. Took about, again, 8 to 13 months to do that. But after the successful change there, they were able to pitch and to bid to a much wider area of grants. So that has transformed what they do as well as how they do it. I hope I explained that in some sensible way. If not, please ask another question, Martina.
Thank you. It certainly made sense to me, and Martina has written thank you.
Oh, okay, good.
Idris from Freetown, Sierra Leone has asked, what is the easiest methodology used to attract funding from donors?
Well, the first one would be to join a funding webinar, I think. Jules, when is our next one running? The donor update and the funding update?
That is our next announcement on the 6th of September. We can't wait to have you.
Right, okay. So the 6th of September, my colleagues will give a comprehensive update on all the donor trends for this next final quarter of 2023 and the funding update. There you would hear in a very summarized, compressed space about what the donors are thinking. The other one is the good and oldie of donor engagement, having a very relevant mission, active engagement to these donor groups, and obviously writing really, really good bits. But I don't want to distract too much from the topic of this webinar.
Thank you, Chris. It looks like we don't have any more questions. So
yes.
If you don't mind going to the next slide.
Oh, sorry, yeah, will do.
Oh, one more question from Desmond. Oh, no question. Apologies. So we have some very exciting news. As most of you know, which you would have gotten our newsletter and various other communications from MZN International, we have relaunched our training courses, in-person training courses. Of course, these were all put on hold due to COVID, and now we are back in action. We have training courses set up, as you can see here, write winning proposals, NGO financial sustainability, and to write winning proposal budgets and monitor project budgets. We have had so much intake and interest on these courses that we are looking at our 2024 and 2025 calendars to set up dates around the world. If you have a country that you would be interested in setting up your own personalized course, please do send us an email. But please also do go onto our website, sign up, register, and get involved.
Great. That sounds really good.
And then our next, as we mentioned earlier, our next webinar is the quarterly funding briefing. And following that is 5 tips to secure commercial contracts. So our quarterly funding briefing brings many people. So make sure you register to get your spot. It's always interesting to know the latest updates.
I think we have the updates from the USAID and the EU coming in on this September after the summer break is over. So my colleagues in Brussels and DC will pitch in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Chris, for all of your fantastic insights. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Jules. Really appreciate it. Glad that this was a brief and short one. And I hope nobody finds themselves in the situation we talked about today. And if you do, then please do reach out. Maybe we can help a little. And if not, see you very much at the next webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.